You can see the title of my paper up there, The Better Angels, Presidential Rhetoric, Democratic Ideals, and the Presidency of Donald Trump. When Donald Trump made the announcement of his intention to seek the presidency in June 2015, he previewed some of the rhetorical themes that would come to characterize both his campaign and his presidency: that the country was in deep trouble, that we had become a dumping ground for other countries' problems, that illegal immigration had to stop, that unemployment was much higher than admitted by government figures, that our military needed rebuilding, that Obamacare had to be repealed, that our veterans had been abandoned, that our government leaders were terrible negotiators who had made bad deals, but that he, Trump, would negotiate better deals and bring jobs back to America, that he would build a great wall on our southern border, protect the Second Amendment, end Common Core, and rebuild America's infrastructure. Sadly, he concluded, the American dream is dead. We need somebody that can take the brand of the United States and make it great again. Unsurprisingly, he nominated himself. In an odd sort of way, my talk today is precisely about Trump's efforts to rebrand America and to redefine the American dream. My argument is that to accomplish those goals, Trump abandoned the American creed and traditional democratic ideals, effected an inversion of the values that underlay both American exceptionalism and the American dream, and did so in part by displacing the theological assumptions that have historically undergirded the American story. The result of these actions, I shall argue, is that President Trump has betrayed the very idea of America. To establish these contentions, I will first review what it means to claim that America is both an idea and a country. I am not claiming that Trump has betrayed his country. That would be treason. But I am claiming that he has betrayed the idea of America, an idea developed over a period of almost 400 years. That idea is intimately connected to what scholars call American exceptionalism, the belief that America holds a special place in the world order that is in some sense divinely ordained. I will review some of the values traditionally associated with American exceptionalism and describe how those values, which were largely theological in origin, came to take on political expression through the articulation and expansion of the American creed. Later, I will show how Trump has abandoned much of the creed and has subverted the values upon which both the creed and the American dream are based. To accomplish all of this, I will draw on a wide swath of presidential rhetoric, American hymns and songs, and other cultural artifacts that bear testimony to the idea of America. Let's start with a quotation from one of the world's leading philosophers, U2's Bono. In an interview on the Charlie Rose Show, Bono observed, "Look, America is like the best idea the world ever came up with. But Donald Trump is potentially the worst idea that ever happened to America, potentially could destroy it. Because America is not just a country. Ireland is a nice country. Great Britain is a great country, all the rest. But it's not an idea. America is an idea. And that idea is bound up in justice and equality for all. Equality and justice for all, you know. And this, I think of Emma Lazarus, those lines, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. This is America." Bono was articulating an idea deeply embedded in the history and myth of America. It is an idea that had its first expression in 1630 when John Winthrop, on board the ship Arbella, preached a sermon in which he said that the new venture in what would come to be called God's New Israel would only be successful if the people fulfilled God's mandate. We shall be as a city on a hill, he proclaimed. The eyes of all people are upon us. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was to be an example to the world. The idea that local governance was to be conducted under the eye of an all-seeing God permeated the new colonies. Justice and righteousness were demanded by a sovereign God who were to be translated into local ordinances and governing codes. This is where the story of America begins. It is articulated in laws, preached in sermons, given expression in song and verse, and ultimately finds its most significant expression in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among which are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Note that the deist Jefferson, like the Puritan Winthrop, locates the source of equality in God's creation. Note, too, that these are unalienable rights, rights that cannot be removed or abridged or made alien to any human being. And thus the American idea, the American creed, began to assume a distinct rhetorical form. That form would be given expression in many different ways, in mottos such as E pluribus unum, out of many one, and in God we trust, in constitutional guarantees of freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, in songs and poetry, and most eloquently, in the everyday lives of people who came to America, the country, seeking America, the idea. Perhaps Michael Kaplow says it best. America is not just a place. America is an idea. The immigrants who flocked here in droves in the 19th and 20th centuries were not doing a cost-benefit analysis of the relative strengths of the American military or land mass compared to other European countries. The billions of people around the globe today who lap up American culture do not do so because they admire the separation of powers laid out in the first 3 articles of the Constitution. The strength of America's brands is not because McDonald's has some sort of culinary secret that eludes Chinese fast food companies. It is because people around the world have historically seen the United States not just as a place on the map, but as something bigger. The power of the American dream and the iconography of the Statue of Liberty mean something. They have value far beyond feel-good expressions of patriotism. They represent America as something for which to strive, as an expression of hopes and dreams for a better life, as a fulfillment of a quest for ultimate safety and prosperity and liberty. They represent America not just as a place for Americans, but as Ronald Reagan so aptly put it when borrowing from John Winthrop, as a shining city upon a hill for the entire world. The power of the United States comes from many sources, but more than anything else, it comes from the strength of the American idea. The idea of America is often expressed in mythic and narrative terms. In presidential rhetoric, that often takes the form of telling stories about the founding, relating events that point toward divine approval, and celebrating the promise of America. Such stories are usually found in genres such as presidential nomination acceptance speeches, inaugural addresses, and special occasion speeches, such as those on Memorial Day or the 4th of July or Veterans Day. For example, George Washington, in his first inaugural address, reminded his listeners, "No people can be bound to acknowledge and adore the invisible hand which conducts the affairs of men more than the people of the United States. Every step by which they have advanced to the character of an independent nation seems to have been distinguished by some token of providential agency." Or consider Ronald Reagan's 1980 acceptance speech. 360 years ago, in 1620, a group of families dared to cross a mighty ocean to build a future for themselves in a new world. When they arrived at Plymouth, Massachusetts, they formed what they called a compact, an agreement among themselves to build a community and abide by its laws. The single act, the voluntary binding together of free people to live under the law, set the pattern for what was to come. A century and a half later, the descendants of those people pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor to found this nation. Some forfeited their fortunes and their lives. None sacrificed honor. In 2009, Barack Obama said in his first inaugural, "The time has come to reaffirm our enduring spirit, to choose our better history, to carry forward that precious gift, that noble idea passed on from generation to generation, the God-given promise that all are equal, all are free, and all deserve a chance to pursue their full measure of happiness. For us, they packed up their few worldly possessions and traveled across oceans in search of a new life. For us, they toiled in sweatshops and settled the West and endured the lash of the whip and plowed the hard earth. For us, they fought and died in places like Concord and Gettysburg, Normandy and Quezon. Time and again, these men and women struggled and sacrificed and worked till their hands were so raw that we might live a better life. They saw America as bigger than the sum of our individual ambitions, greater than all the differences of birth or wealth or faction." Now, I quote from these three speeches at length because they illustrate many of the features of what I am calling the idea of America. The idea that America was somehow providentially chosen by God to serve as an example to the world. The idea that America was formed by many different kinds of people who chose to unite as one under the color of law. The idea that freedom and equality and the pursuit of happiness are uniquely American ideals, and the idea that America is even bigger than the sum of our individual ambitions. There is a transcendent dimension to the idea of America. But when we turn to Donald Trump's 2016 acceptance speech and his 2017 inaugural address, what do we find? His acceptance speech is unlike any acceptance of the past 85 years. He makes no mention of the founders, has no references to American myth or history, engages no patriotic songs or poetry, tells us nothing about the nature of the presidential office, lauds no former presidents, makes no mention of God or his own religious beliefs, and has nothing to say about the destiny of America beyond his promise to make her great again. It is the rare acceptance speech that does not, in some manner, acknowledge the founders. Reflection upon the founders reminds us that American political life is about a way of life. It reminds us that political service is not about the individual alone, but for the good of the whole, even the whole of mankind. It points to the truth that we are part of a larger community that has often required sacrifice and even people's lives. Equally baffling is Trump's failure to cite even one instance from American history. The speech is ahistorical. It exists in a vacuum of the moment, as though the current situation has no relationship to yesteryear. Most acceptance speeches acknowledge their participation in the ongoing flow of American history, but not Trump's. That there is both character and content in American history seems not to have occurred to him. There are no lessons of history, no recall of American principles or values. Trump makes no mention of God beyond the closing, "God bless you." His focus is on the moment and the crowd in front of him. He quotes no scriptures, alludes to no proverbs, reveals nothing of his own religious commitments. Not all presidential nominees are religious, of course, but virtually all of them have at least acknowledged a supreme being, not Trump. By the time Trump assumed the presidency on January 20th of 2017, he had already established a rhetorical signature characterized by radical departures from traditional norms. His inaugural address continued mostly in that same vein. There's no mention of the founders, no references to myth or history, no lauding of former presidents, no citation of patriotic songs or verses. There is a brief mention of God and the citation of a scriptural passage, But like his acceptance speech, Trump's inaugural is focused on the present moment and what he will do to restore American prestige. And that prestige, he makes clear, revolves around purely material matters. We will bring back our wealth, he promises, and we will bring back our dreams. For Trump, the American dream, which he had proclaimed dead in his acceptance speech, can only be restored by material accoutrements, jobs for the people, money for the military, wealth for the nation. A new vision will govern our land, he promised. From this day forward, it is going to be only America first. America first. But from the standpoint of the idea of America, this rhetoric is highly problematic. As Abram Van Ingen writes, the basic premise of America first contradicts the main assumptions of American exceptionalism. American exceptionalism has always said that because of its unique history, the United States must model and spread democracy, religious liberty, freedom, free enterprise, diversity, human dignity, self-government, you name it. 1,000 points of light, a candle, a beacon, a city on a hill. Van Ingen goes on to explain that Trump's rhetoric does not offer a moral vision of freedom, democracy, opportunity, immigration, asylum, or any other traditional term of American exceptionalism. America first comes not from a sense of divine election, but from a worldview based in the utter absence of any higher moral good. America first urges self-interest in a world seen as a survival of the fittest, where winners make losers and losers have no claim to sympathy. The goal is to get ahead, and getting ahead means leaving others behind. That such a view also flies directly in the face of the American dream seems not to have occurred to Trump. For him, it is material wealth in all its dimensions that makes a country great. Hence, in order to make America great again, he must restore its material standing in the world and among the people. His is an inward-facing stance that invites people to judge the nation only on the basis of winners and losers, with winning and losing being determined by wealth alone. How different this is from the vision of Ronald Reagan, who said, "We must preserve the noble promise of the American dream for every man, woman, and child in this land. That promise was not created by America. It was given to America as a gift from a loving God, a gift profoundly recognized by the language of liberty in the world's greatest charters of freedom, our Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, and the Bill of Rights." Here, Reagan recognizes that the American dream is given life through what he calls the language of liberty. And that language of liberty is found in the historic documents of our founding as a nation. This language of liberty constitutes the democratic ideals that breathe life into the dream: freedom, equality, justice, unalienable rights, law, union, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness chief among them. In Reagan's lexicon, liberty always has a moral foundation. Liberty has never meant license to Americans, he said. We treasure it precisely because it protects the human and spiritual values that we hold most dear: the right to worship as we choose, the right to elect democratic leaders, the right to choose the type of education we want for our children, and freedom from fear and want and oppression. These are God-given freedoms, not the contrivances of man. And these are what most people mean when they speak about the American dream. But when one examines Mr. Trump's speeches, or even his tweets, there is an immediate recognition that most of these democratic ideals find little to no expression in Trump's lexicon. He seldom speaks of democracy, or liberty, or justice, or unalienable rights. When he speaks about law, it is only in the context of law and order. The pursuit of happiness is reduced to material gain, with no recognition of the spiritual or moral or ethical values that have traditionally supported that pursuit. Indeed, I would go so far as to claim that Trump has actually inverted the values associated with the language of liberty, replacing them with a narrow understanding of material gain represented by terms such as wealth, prosperity, rich, and economic success. He has been able to do this by suppressing the theological presuppositions that are foundational both to American exceptionalism and to the American dream. Hence his reluctance to use the word God, to quote from Scripture, or to invoke the ways of divine providence in his speeches. He has no need for God because he rejects American exceptionalism and has a fundamentally flawed view of the American dream, which he understands only in material terms. According to James Cook, Mr. Trump is far from the first president to diverge from the democratic ideals of the United States, but in doing so as brazenly, as often, and in such a racially and religiously charged manner, he fosters division at home and imperils his country's reputation abroad. A brief overview of Trump's rhetoric on immigration, race, and religion confirms Cook's judgment. I focus on these three dimensions because they are at the heart of American exceptionalism and the American dream. Although immigration has long been a divisive topic, most American presidents have celebrated immigrants, wished them well, and identified them as important contributors to the American mosaic. Most have understood that immigrants come to America precisely because of those democratic ideals and the opportunity to pursue their dreams. As President Ford said at a 1976 naturalization ceremony, to be an American is to subscribe to those principles which the Declaration of Independence proclaims and the Constitution protects. The political values of self-government, liberty and justice, equal rights and equal opportunity. These beliefs are the secrets of America's unity from diversity, in my judgment, the most magnificent achievement of our 200 years as a nation. Mr. Trump does not speak in this register when discussing immigration. Indeed, he tends to reduce immigration to two issues, race and religion. Starting as early as his announcement speech, Trump identified the immigration issue with Mexicans, proclaiming, when Mexico sends their people, they're not sending their best. They're sending people that have lots of problems, and they're bringing those problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people. The flow of bodies through the southern border was so great that Trump proposed a great wall be built to keep Mexicans out. This is, needless to say, a far cry from Emma Lazarus, give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free. There will be no huddled masses in Donald Trump's America. Neither will there be Muslims if he has his way. Shortly after making the comment about Mexicans, Trump wondered whether he could shut down American mosques. Totally oblivious to the constitutional mandate that protects freedom of religious expression, one of those troubling democratic ideals, Trump said, I'd hate to do it, to close those mosques, but it's something you're going to have to strongly consider because some of the ideas and some of the hatred, absolute hatred, is coming from those areas. He then followed these musings by claiming that American Arab citizens were cheering as the buildings came down on 9/11, a charge later proven to be baseless. In what was probably his most egregious proposal of the campaign season, Trump recommended killing the families of Muslim terrorists. When you get these terrorists, he advised, you have to take out their families. On December 7th of 2015, the Trump campaign released a statement that read, Donald J. Trump is calling for a total and complete shutdown of Muslims entering the United States until our country's representatives can figure out what is going on. 1 week after his inauguration, Trump signed an executive order blocking Syrian refugees and banning citizens of 7 predominantly Muslim countries from entering the United States for 90 days. That order and each of his subsequent efforts to ban Muslims have been overturned by the federal courts. But Trump persists in his efforts to use race and religion as criteria for immigration enforcement. Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric flies in the face of American presidential rhetoric dating all the way back to John Adams. In 1796, upon the signing of the Treaty of Tripoli, Adams said, the United States has in itself no character of enmity against the laws, religion, or tranquility of Muslims. George W. Bush, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, spoke directly to Muslims saying, we respect your faith. It's practiced freely by millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah. And Barack Obama, speaking in front of a Muslim audience in Cairo, Egypt, said, "The dream of opportunity for all people has not come true for everyone in America, but its promise exists for all who come to our shores, and that includes nearly 7 million American Muslims in our country today, who, by the way, enjoy incomes and education levels that are higher than the American average. Moreover, freedom in America is indivisible from the freedom to practice one's religion." Trump's anti-Muslim rhetoric violates the foundational freedoms of which American presidents have repeatedly spoken. Trump's most recent rhetorical foray into the immigration debate came on January 11th of this year, when, in what he thought was a private meeting with congressmen, he asked, "Why are we having all these people from shithole countries come here?" He worried that Nigerian immigrants wouldn't ever, quote, "go back to their huts in Africa," and disparaged immigrants from Haiti by asking, "Why do we want Haitians here?" One of those immigrants from Haiti, Congresswoman Maya Love, charged that Trump's comments were unkind, divisive, elitist, and fly in the face of our nation's values. And that is precisely the point. Trump's views on immigration do fly in the face of our country's values because those values are reflective of democratic ideals based on the American creed. But because Trump rejects American exceptionalism, rejects many of the democratic institutions that grew up to represent those values, and suppresses the theological presuppositions that lay behind that creed and those institutions, he feels free to do and say things that betray the idea of America that has held sway for almost 400 years. According to Kathleen Hall Jamieson and Doran Taussig, Trump's rhetoric deviates from the tradition of celebrating democratic institutions and rejects the key self-definition of America as exceptional. By indicting America's key institutions, Trump reinforces this rejection and advances the claim that the country is in crisis and in need of his strong leadership. Instead of following in the American tradition by celebrating diversity, proclaiming our essential unity, and emphasizing our common destiny, Trump does the exact opposite. He essentializes race, he intentionally divides, and he calls into question the future of the country absent his extraordinary leadership. More troubling yet, he seems not to understand that most Americans come from immigrant backgrounds, and that by denigrating some countries as shitholes, he is by implication attacking all of the countries from which Americans came. Columnist Bret Stephens saw this clearly when he wrote, America is a nation of holers. It is an improbably yet wildly successful experiment in the transformation by means of hope, opportunity, ambition of holers into doers, makers, thinkers, and givers. Are you of Irish descent, Italian, Polish, Scottish, Chinese? Chances are your ancestors did not get here on a boat because life in the old country was placid and prosperous and Grandpa owned a bank. With few exceptions, Americans are the dregs of the wine, the chaff of the wheat. If you don't know this by now, it makes you the wax in the ear. Donald Trump is the wax in the ear. It is an arresting image, but accurate. Trump does not hear the song that is the idea of America. David Brooks, in a recent column titled "What Holds America Together," wrote, "The American consciousness can be formed only by the lab reports we give one another about that experiment. The Jeremiads, speeches, songs, conversations that describe what the experiment is for, where it has failed, and how it should proceed now." Many American presidents have heard that song and articulated its verses, as when Ronald Reagan wondered, can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom here, as a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe freely. Or when George W. Bush asserted, "It is the American story, a story of flawed and fallible people united across the generations by grand and enduring ideals. The grandest of these ideals is an unfolding American promise that everyone belongs, that everyone deserves a chance, that no insignificant person was ever born." Or when Barack Obama said, "This country of ours has more wealth than any nation, but that's not what makes us rich. We have the most powerful military on earth, but that's not what makes us strong. Our universities and our culture are the envy of the world, but that's not what keeps the world coming to our shores. Instead, it is that American spirit, that American promise, that pushes us forward even when the path is uncertain, that binds us together in spite of our differences, that makes us fix our eyes not on what is seen, but what is unseen, the better place around the bend. That promise is our greatest inheritance." All of these presidents heard the song of America and understood that America is more than just a country. It's an idea. So too have our singers and songwriters. There's a lady that stands in a harbor for what we believe, and there's a bell that still echoes the price that it costs to be free. Oh, beautiful for pilgrim feet whose stern, impassioned stress a thoroughfare for freedom's beat across the wilderness. America, America, God mend thine every flaw. Confirm thy soul in self-control, thy liberty and law. Lift every voice and sing till earth and heaven ring, ring with the harmonies of liberty. My country, 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the pilgrim's pride. From every mountainside, let freedom ring. And if America is to become a great nation, this must become true. So let freedom ring from the prodigious hilltops of New Hampshire. Let freedom ring from the mighty mountains of New York. Let freedom ring from the heightening Alleghenies of Pennsylvania. Let freedom ring from the snow-capped mountains of Colorado. Let freedom ring from the curvaceous slopes of California. But not only that, let freedom ring from Stone Mountain of Georgia. Let freedom ring from Lookout Mountain of Tennessee. Let freedom ring from every hill and molehill of Mississippi, from every mountainside. Let freedom ring. Dr. King and every other person who has understood the idea of America has recognized that the promise of freedom and liberty and equality is just that, a promise. That promise must be redeemed in action and renewed with each successive generation. Jim Wallace had it exactly right when he noted that American history has been nothing less than the steady battle of a country trying to live up to its ideals. But what happens when those ideals are no longer articulated by the nation's leader? What happens when white supremacists and far-right nationalists are equated with peaceful protesters? What happens when people are judged by their race or religion rather than by the content of their character? What happens when the President of the United States thinks the symbol of a great democracy should be a wall? By forgetting who we are as a people, we risk forgetting our own history. This was, of course, precisely what Ronald Reagan warned against in his farewell address when he said, "We've got to do a better job of getting across that America is freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of enterprise. And freedom is special and rare. It's fragile. It needs protection. If we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit. America is an idea, but contained within that idea, within those democratic ideals, is a long and often painful history. If the idea withers, the history disappears. We risk forgetting all of the sacrifice that has gone into making America what it is today, from Nathan Hale, who gave his life on behalf of a new nation, to Crispus Attucks, to the tens of thousands who died in the Middle Passage to America, to the women who stood up to the slave power by signing petitions even when it was illegal to do so, to Senator Sumner, who was nearly beaten to death for having the audacity to support black civil rights, to Eugene V. Debs, who went to jail rather than support what he considered an unjust war, to the 4 chaplains who gave away their life jackets as the Dorchester was sinking so that others might survive, to Schwerner, Goodman, and Cheney, whose only crime was trying to register people to vote in Mississippi. These too are part of the idea of America. These too are representative of democratic ideals. Much of President Trump's rhetoric is based on the principle of division, not the American principle of unity. It's the people versus their own government. It's the native-born versus immigrants. It's Christians and Jews versus Muslims. It's the promise of safety versus the perception of danger. It's winners versus losers. It's fear versus faith in the American dream. This president has great difficulty articulating the dream, but he's very good at stoking fear. Rather than wanting America to be emulated, writes Nick Bryant, it would appear that Trump prefers it to be feared. Yet if we allow fear to dictate our policies and close our shores to today's refugees, says Sid Ziegler, then we have lost America, the idea and the nation, forever. And that, in a nutshell, is my greatest fear. I fear we are on the precipice of losing the America we have known and loved for all of its 242 years. In his speech, A More Perfect Union, Barack Obama observed that we cannot solve the challenges of our time unless we solve them together, unless we perfect our union by understanding that we may have different stories, but we hold common hopes, that we may not look the same and we may not have come from the same place, but we all want to move in the same direction toward a better future for our children and our grandchildren. And so how do we do that? How do we work together to achieve our common humanity? There are, of course, no easy answers, but I take succor in the words of Abraham Lincoln. The year was 1861. Lincoln had just been elected president of a country already breaking apart, with the threat of civil war heavy in the air. He delivered what may be the greatest inaugural address in American history, a plea for his fellow countrymen in the South to come to their senses, compromise, and avoid war. It was a speech given in a losing cause, for as we know, the South rejected Lincoln's palm branch and the war came. He ended his speech with these words, "I am loath to close. We are not enemies, but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break our bonds of affection. The mystic cords of memory stretching from every battlefield and patriot grave to every living heart and hearthstone all over this broad land will yet swell the course of the Union when again touched, as surely they will be, by the better angels of our nature." The better angels of our nature. What could Lincoln have had in mind? As I contemplated his words, 3 thoughts struck me. First, that there is an affective, emotional component of the better angels. When touched, he says, to be touched is to be affected in some way. It involves an emotional response. Second, there is a faith dimension to the better angels, as surely they must be. Surely is a statement of faith. the belief that something will happen even when the evidence is currently lacking. And third, that the better angels are angels of our nature. Lincoln was not calling on supernatural forces, not heavenly angels, but the forces of good within ourselves. We must find the better angels within each of our souls. As Christopher Halshick notes, the world we inhabit is often a cold, hard, and unfair place. It always has been. But you can't find the goodness in it unless you find the goodness in yourself. They are one and the same. And so I end today by suggesting 5 action steps to bring out the better angels of our nature. Steps that our own history suggests are within the reach of humanity if only we will strive for them. I believe we are in the presence of our better angels when we first practice forbearance and tolerance towards others. Lincoln illustrated that in his first inaugural, but so have many other presidents. In the midst of the Revolutionary War, General Washington was so concerned about respecting the religious rights of Catholics as revolutionary forces marched on Quebec that he issued this order to his field commander. I also give it in charge to you to avoid all disrespect to or contempt of the religion of the country and its ceremonies. Prudence, policy, and a true Christian spirit will lead us to look with compassion upon their errors without insulting them. While we are contending for our own liberty, we should be very cautious of violating the rights of conscience in others, ever considering that God alone is the judge of the hearts of men, and to him only in this case they are answerable. Forbearance and tolerance, especially towards those with whom we disagree. Secondly, pursuit of justice even in the face of opposition. When John Kennedy was confronted with the issue of equal rights for Black Americans, he was faced with a decision. Give in to the southern wing of his party, the wing that controlled Congress, controlled the budget, controlled the movement of all the legislation he wanted, or stand up for justice, even in the face of his own party's opposition. JFK opted for justice. In a nationwide television address, he said, "We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot eat lunch in a restaurant open to the public, if he cannot send his children to the best public school available, if he cannot vote for public officials who will represent him, if in short he cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place? Who among us would be content with the counsels of patience and delay? 100 years of delay have passed since President Lincoln freed the slaves, yet their heirs, their grandsons, are not fully free. They are not yet freed from the bonds of injustice. They are not yet freed from social and economic oppression. And this nation, for all its hopes and all its boasts, will not be fully free until all its citizens are free." Thus did Kennedy pursue justice, as did Martin Luther King in his opposition to the Vietnam War, and Franklin Roosevelt in his battle against the economic royalists of 1933. Hearing the call to justice is a sign of our better angels. Third, another such sign is our recognition of a common humanity. In his 2009 inaugural, Obama said, "For we know that our patchwork heritage is a strength, not a weakness. We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture drawn from every end of this earth, because we have tasted the bitter swill of civil war and segregation and emerged from that dark chapter stronger and more unified. We cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass, the lines of tribes shall soon dissolve, that as the world grows smaller, our common humanity shall reveal itself, and that America must play its role in ushering in a new era of peace. Dr. King also spoke of our common humanity when he told his listeners at Riverside Church, beyond the calling of race or nation or creed is this vocation of sonship and brotherhood. And because I believe that the Father is deeply concerned, especially for his suffering and helpless and outcast children, I come tonight to speak for them. This I believe to be the privilege and the burden of all of us who deem ourselves bound by allegiances and loyalties which are broader and deeper than nationalism, and which go beyond a nation's self-defined goals and positions. Looking at the world from the perspective of the other, instead of self or religion or nation, is a sign of our better angels. So too forth is the ability to bestow grace and forgiveness, even in situations where that grace or forgiveness may not be rationally warranted. At the end of the Civil War, with 600,000 dead Americans to mourn, Lincoln found it within himself to utter those immortal words, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. As has often been observed, Lincoln does not distinguish the North from the South. He offers grace to an enemy that is still in the field even as he speaks. Malice toward none, charity for all. That's a better angel speaking. Finally, perhaps the ultimate sign of a better angel is the act of public repentance, of admitting wrong, of confessing sin. In the case of Bill Clinton, it was confession of illicit sex and poor judgment. In the case of two-time presidential candidate George Wallace, it was a plea for forgiveness after an entire lifetime of spewing segregationist hatred. The better angels finally emerged. If there is a hope that the country can survive a president who is intolerant, blind to systemic injustices, a committed nationalist, lacking in understanding the place of grace, and convinced that he has no need of forgiveness for anything, then that hope lies with you and with your generation. It lies with young people who understand and value the idea of America. It lies with even younger generations, represented by a 12-year-old boy named Jonathan. When asked in an essay contest, what does it mean to be an American, Jonathan wrote, "Being an American does not mean that you go to baseball games and eat hot dogs, but to live your life out to the fullest, not just waving around a flag every day. Being an American is to help another, whether it be Polish or Chinese or Afghan or Muslim. Being an American means helping your sworn enemy even if you do not wish, but you shall help with dignity and pride. Being American means that you capture the true essence of every being, from the simplest flower to the most beautiful person in the world. Being an American means to be united as one under whatever deity you worship, and to be able to depend, rely on, give hope to each other. Because being an American does not mean living in America. Every person has a part of being an American in them, deep inside, embedded, until they wish to release that piece and share it with the world. That is what a true American is. And truly it is written out of the mouth of babes. May your better angels guide you now and in all the years to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Medhurst, for those deep and graceful words. I think that you had impact on all of us in the way we think about our country and our presidency. We only have a couple of minutes, but I think we would certainly like to entertain a question or two of Dr. Medhurst, if anyone would like to offer one.
Well, first, thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed your paper. From a student researcher's perspective, I'm wondering, how on earth did you narrow down 400 years of American rhetoric and to find the right sources to use in your paper?
Well, I've been studying presidential rhetoric ever since I was a graduate student at Penn State. So, over 40 years, you pretty much have read all of the important stuff. I was simply able to go back and check, the sources I thought I knew where certain things were, and usually they were there, and sometimes I had to look a little harder, but mostly it's just through having studied and taught presidential rhetoric for a long time.
Just wanted to reiterate, thank you for your very eloquent remarks. I was curious if you looked at all at Trump's National Prayer Breakfast speeches, because it seems like that would be one context in which he might appeal to a higher power.
I have not studied them specifically. I am broadly aware that they exist. And I must say, I did notice in his recent comments on the strike on Syria that he actually mentioned God 3 times in the speech, which is very different. And so perhaps we are seeing an evolution from how he began. Time will tell.
I think we are all anxious, too, to get to our next session. So be sure that you sign in for the raffle and stick around for the drawing afterwards. I hope you enjoy your last session. Thank you again, Dr. Medhurst, for those lovely words.
Thank you.